Okay, good morning, guys. Welcome to a special time for environmental social justice. We have Ms. Joy Langford, our in-house environmental consultant. Good morning.
Good morning.
And today we have Mr. Josh Harrison with the Center for Force Majeure. And Josh is visiting us today from New York City. He splits his time between Santa Cruz, California, and New York, where he works for the whole thing is the study for the Study Center for the Force Majeure.
It's the study for the Center of the Force Majeure, and it's a complicated title, but basically we're an art science collective that comes out of about 40 years of environmental artwork and activism that is a product of actually my parents, who started working in the art and environmental field in the 1970s, starting by growing things, and found themselves, by virtue of asking the right kinds of dumb questions, to be the first people in the world to grow crabs in captivity, thus getting serious attention of Scripps Institute, and later moved on into other kinds of environmental issues, which were as basic as putting ideas out in a gallery, or as large as shifting the environmental master plan for the province of Holland, and literally everything in between. And so about 10 years ago, the University of California at Santa Cruz sort of said, let's see if we can't fund a center. Fund is, of course, usually a funny term here, but let's just say support a center that we'll take some of these ideas and see if we can't go from galleries into implementation in different ways. So that's been the mission of the center, is to take a provocative look at where things are ecologically, looking at the well-being of the planet as the sort of highest good and working backwards from that, and thinking differently about things. We sort of use a lot of metaphorical analyses to sort of come in. Some of them sort of looking at how water works in California. We start from the premise that, and I'll say something like, only a fool fights the ocean. Wise folk dance with the rising waters. So what does that mean? Well, if you think differently about how you're doing it, then what if fighting the rising waters in San Francisco isn't the right way to go? And if waters are going to rise 10, 12, 15 feet, which it looks like they might well, since we're not controlling our temperature too well, then why are we putting dams up and gates up? Why don't we see what we could do if floods reclaim, say, the northern estuaries of the Central Valley? And we know a couple of things about estuaries. We know that estuaries are among the most highly biotically productive areas on the planet. So what if we went from dry food, which is monoculture, intensively cultivated deserts that require massive amounts of energy, machinery, and other kinds of carbon-based input to thrive, and aren't doing a really great job of it in the long term? What if we took a lot of that land and moved it into, basically organically evolving wetlands, and looked at the wet weight of low on the food chain shellfish and other kinds of plants, and looked at the protein that one might harvest without damaging the system? One of our other big things we look at is, how do we create systems where, as we say, the harvest preserves the system, that we're actually taking out from abundance, and not actually trying to extract anything, but actually sharing from the overflow. And a really great example of that might be what is New York, New York Harbor. The signature sign of New York Harbor when the Europeans came was the oyster. An oyster is a really wonderful critter. It lays over 1 billion eggs, to come out. And it doesn't have any expectation that it's going to have 1 billion oysters out of that. It expects that most of that will be eaten by other things. So why should we not share in that abundance?
Good point.
And if we share in that abundance and we give back to the oyster fields, we end up with thriving oyster fields of billions of oysters. So when Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson River, he could tell where the Lenape settlements were by the height of the oyster middens, 30, 40, 50 feet high in some places. That's how he located the villages. And New York Harbor was a great, great, powerful estuary. It could become that again. There's nothing that we're doing that we can't also bring back natural systems in and rebuild that harbor, San Francisco Harbor, all the great harbors of the world can all have that. So one of the things we do at the center is we look at the metaphorical flip that happens when you stop saying we have to do business as usual and start saying, well, what if we do things differently? What if we look at things differently? And as artists, we get a chance to peer at things and basically without asking permission. You know, what we might kind of say the eye of a stranger. We're close to the material. We know a fair bit about what's going on, but we're not locked into what other people who've spent their lives dedicated to doing something have had to do. So we're able to find a way to synthesize other kinds of moments. And that's been the goal of the center. And just to go back to our complicated name, we use the term force majeure in a way that you might appreciate, Wendy. We use the legal term, the insurance term, ecologically to say, we look at problems that are too big and too complicated, that have inputs that are way out of our own control. And as the legal term of force majeure basically is when the insurance companies say, we wash our hands of your problem, it's an act of God, we can't deal with it. Well, we're saying we have to deal with it. Those are exactly the problems we want to deal with, and that's why this. Well,
I find this to be like super interesting, especially your mantra on how things should be thought of, and whether it's an oyster in the ocean or if it's, you know, raising cattle or talking about impossible meats or any sort of organics. It's a lesson that can be learned across the board with anything that we're trying to do to sustain the environment. Not putting too much pressure on ourselves as far as, you know, where are we going to mine lithium? Just also thinking of alternative ways for us to get to where we want to get to, with whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's waste in waste fields or air quality, anything.
Sure.
So that's a really powerful idea that the center is trying to push forward. And I'm glad that you're doing it in artistic ways, right? Because we all can't be scientists or geologists like Wendy or doctors of the environment, right? You're reaching people where they are at all levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I believe it's a question of, I strongly believe we have to start with the story. We have to start with the metaphor of who we are. If we don't do that, we can't fix the problems, because the problems come out of the story that we have now. The story that we have now is that Western civilization is the apex of everything and all, and we have to do things mechanically. We have a whole history of success that has brought us to where we are, but that success is also a history of failure. Oh. And we can't succeed by continuing to act in the ways that have failed us and are continuing to fail us. We can't, and agriculture is a great example. We think we've fed the world, but no, we've fed a lot of cows. We've spent billions and trillions of dollars to feed cows on an industrial scale, and also now increasingly to feed gasoline plants on an industrial scale. We haven't fed people. We could feed people. The amount of agricultural output we do now is more than sufficient protein to feed every single person on the planet. So, but we don't distribute it that way. We don't organize it that way. What if we didn't do that? Where's what? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Where's the agriculture going? If we're
it's almost all done to feed meat. You know, and it's a categories of scale. It takes 10 pounds of grass to put 1 pound of beef. Chicken and pork are somewhat less, but so it's just a matter of magnitude. If the more meat we eat industrially, the more we're spending time growing food for, and most corn in this country, which is one of the biggest crops, is grown to feed cattle, and they're not adapted to cattle. So corn is not a food that beef cows actually know how to eat very well. So they belch it out the front and they fart it out the back, and there you go, 4 and 6 on the drawdown scale of methane into the atmosphere, simply because we're eating too much meat too poorly. I mean, you can make an argument that we shouldn't be eating meat at all. I don't make that argument, but we certainly shouldn't be eating the quantities, and we certainly shouldn't be growing the quantities of beef. At the same time, there's a huge opportunity for cows raised in pasture, for animals raised in pasture, to reconstitute a more active living web of agricultural life. You know, why are we growing one plant? Why are we creating these vast deserts? And remember, in a corn plantation, you have one species alone that you want. That's it. You're creating an artificial desert, and you're spending huge amounts of energy, fossil fuels, and mechanical tools to make that. And then you're also creating an industry where it's designed to turn everything into things that can be harvested by machines, because we don't like people. And the people who are in the forest, we have to make them look like machines and work like machines. So we dehumanize the vast majority of people in farming, because we want them to act increasingly like machines. And we really, and until very recently, we didn't even require bathrooms for farm workers in California. That's a recent law. That's not, you know, I mean, let alone, right. Well, we know nothing about most of these things, and we like it that way. That's another thing that we need to be thinking about. We have a society that says, okay, I'm going to specialize in what I know, and everybody else is going to take care of it. And whatever the little people do is not my business, really. You know, because we, you know, in another larger sense, nature's an organic whole, but we've been fighting against nature. We've been fighting against natural systems, you know, certainly since the Enlightenment. You know, the whole notion of free energy is this fight against having to behave according to the patterns around us. We don't like how cold it is. Now we have, you know, we used to have to figure out how to stay warm in all kinds of ways that involved physical labor. We had to get wood. We had to get animal skins. We had to huddle together. We had to build houses or shelters that were naturally containing heat. Oh, no, cheap oil says we don't have to do any of that. We just have to burn 200 million year old sunlight very quickly, and, you know, take that. We want it. It's too hot out. We don't have to worry about living someplace where it's not so hot, or it's spending much of our day resting in the hot climate and waiting for the nighttime to actually do our work the way we had to at a previous time. Now we have cheap energy. Cheap energy gives us air conditioning. Air conditioning makes the heat go away, makes nature disappear. We have to stop thinking that our enemy is nature. We have to start realizing we are one of 12 million species. We have a certain amount of agency. We're only one of 12 million. You know, we're trying to kill them off, maybe only 11 million. That's all that we, you know. But we have to be part of that conversation, and we have to be part of that engagement, and we have to be reciprocated. We have to give back what we take. I mean, nature has no waste. Humans create waste. We think we take something in, we throw it out. Anyway, so Joy?
Josh, you brought up another point that I'd like to kind of get into. Sure. What do you think about some of these ESG programs that a lot of the large corporations like Amazon, anybody who's large right now, they're interested in talking about racial and social equality. And now the big coin phrase while watching Squawk Box and CNBC is ESG, environmental social governance. And what are these programs going to really mean and trickle down to the average farmer? Or
I think that's a great question, Joy. And my first answer is like Gandhi's answer about Western civilization. It'll be nice when it happens. You know, so yes, do I think that environmental social justice is a term that could have some real value? Yes. Do I think it has real value in today as it's being used? Some, but not nearly enough to make a difference. And that's just
to jump in, environmental social governance.
Governance, right.
Well, I'm sorry, environmental social justice. So we rock because we educate. Governance.
Right. Okay, sorry. Wendy, excellent point. Thank you for the clarification. But sure, there's, you know, just to get back to the larger point, The Guardian today has an article that says on banks, and it points out that 7 out of every 10 members of the board of directors of the major banks have direct or indirect ties to fossil fuels. So none of this environmental governance means anything Now, did Amazon give money back to its workers so they don't have to pee in bottles with the $334 billion that the head of Amazon alone, Jeff Bezos, on his own made through no action of his own for the course of this pandemic? Did he do that? Did he give any of it back? Did he allow his workers to unionize so that they could have a better social experience? No. Did he spend a lot of money saying he cares about the environment? Do you know anything directly that has been funded by Amazon's $10 billion commitment to improving the environment, which, by the way, is less than 1/3 of the excess profit he got from experiencing the pandemic and being in a good place to profit from it? So my sense is there is a great need for businesses to function under environmental stewardship. Absolutely critical. We're not going to survive. As Wendy well knows, there are only two industries that are serious that actually look to the future anyway: insurance and pensions. Everybody else looks to the quarter, and no matter what they're telling you, they're only looking to the quarter. And until they change that dynamic, until they change that way, they're not going to support the larger needs of the planet or of human society or of social justice. Amazon could easily make a huge change. They could easily take their vast amounts of excess money and redistribute how it's done. They could do many, many, many things. They're choosing not to. Okay, as long as they choose not to, it's all greenwashing. It's not all greenwashing, but it's largely greenwashing.
I'm glad you mentioned greenwashing. So I know that Amazon is actively working on their environmental social governance and hiring people and working on it. So I have a couple things to say about that. One is most people I've seen that are getting into ESG have no environmental background. So that's kind of a problem, personal issue, right? But second of all, we had a former guest many months ago, Daniel Atwater. He does impact investing, primarily in Africa. And he said, everyone's greenwashing until you're not. And I loved that statement because until proven otherwise, you're greenwashing. And a lot of it is unintentional. They don't know they're greenwashing. They don't know it because they don't have that background or that knowledge base. It's some poor guy that got shoved into the role. Hey, you're not doing ESG, report on it. And they may not necessarily understand what they're doing. And that, I think, is sort of an ongoing problem that we're going to see moving forward. And I bring that up a lot. People don't choose to discuss it. I don't know why.
Wendy, I think you're absolutely right on the micro level, but the macro level, that doesn't hold any water at all. These guys are too rich. They're too powerful. They're too smart by their own things. They're masters of the universe. They don't get any credit for not doing it right. The guys the people in the trenches who are being told to do, make it all work. That's standard business. What's the latest thing? I mean, I spent many years in the corporate trenches. Every 3 years, there's a new model of how a company is going to do business, and everything changes. They change their logo, they change this, they get a whole culture change mission going on. They redo their code of ethics. That whatever it is, it's the latest, the latest flavor of the month. ESG runs that risk before it runs anything. The people at the top know that the planet's in danger. What they don't care enough about, because they're isolated from the impact of their own work. They're isolated from the impact of their own doing. Part of that is the vast amounts of wealth inequality that we have, where we literally have people who live such different lives that they can't physically have the empathy to imagine what other experiences are, because they'll always be protected. Worst comes to worst, they'll be off to Mars with Elon and his rocket ship. That's
which is not a viable alternative. You can't just.
It's not whether it's viable. It doesn't have to be viable. This is never about. I mean, literature tells us about what is the Decameron? What is the Mask of the Red Death? What is any of what we have thousands of examples of people doing exactly the same thing. Thinking they can protect themselves from externalities long enough until it all falls apart. So I think the problem can be more, it's a complicated problem. There's plenty of people of goodwill in business at every level. That's true. But at the top, the decisions aren't being made for goodwill and benefit. They're being made for increasingly silly reasons of profit and loss, and increasingly silly and unsupportable reasons of P&L numbers and expectations, and you cannot change. The business as usual has failed. This is the really important point that we're not taking seriously. It has failed. There's no argument. We wouldn't be in this position. We could have done this conversation in 1968 when the Club of Rome came out. We could have done it in 1972. We could have done it in 1976. We could have done it when Exxon printed its first report in 1977, where it went public about how oil was. We could have done this in 1982. We could have done this at any point in the last 60 years. But we chose not to.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't hard. It was easy then. That's the point. It's hard now.
Yeah.
It was easy then. If we had let Jimmy Carter's, solar installations stand on the White House and continue to build that, we would be in a very different state. It was easy then. We didn't have to do nearly as much, but we chose not to. So, like any exponentially expanding crisis, the longer you wait, the harder, the tougher the choices are, the harder it is, the more you have to do.
Do you see any advances in public-private partnerships in the wake?
Oh, sure.
So we've got the government that has, initiative programs that they have to meet, deadlines they need to meet. There's so many deadlines in the state of California, whether it's 2024, 2035, 2031, you name a date, they've got a zero emissions policy for it. Yes. But we don't really have the funding right now. So do you see any sort of mesh where we can get some money going from the private sector to help the public sector?
Well, I have a little bit of an opinion on that, you might imagine. I do think policy has moved dramatically. I think state policies in California, state policy in New York, what's actually on paper, has moved massively. What hasn't moved is the idea that it's a crisis. So yes, there's been massive advancement. Now, let me give you a quick example. 4 years ago, that's related to fire. 4 years ago, by chance, we had a surprise meeting with then Governor Jerry Brown about the forest fire issue, which is basically, in a very, very simple nutshell, we've suppressed fire. We've suppressed how we manage native traditions. We've extracted. We've allowed forests in California particularly to grow way past their carrying capacity, and that's what's burning, the excess carrying capacity, mostly of younger, thinner trees. So that was true 10 years ago, it was true 5 years ago, it was true the morning that we spent 3 hours with Jerry Brown trying to convince him to change California policy slightly. Got nowhere. But Gavin Newsom's policy on paper is actually very well thought forward. It's very forward thinking, it's moving. And he put $1 billion on the table to move it, which is a much bigger down payment than they had up till then. But they aren't willing to say there's a crisis. We know how to behave in crises. In a very simple way, we have in our lifetimes, the United States, not going elsewhere, the United States has faced three major types of crises that they've all mobilized, and they're very simple, and we're all familiar with them. First is the Apollo moonshot, second is the Great Depression, and third is World War II. There's something about all of those that's different from today. They were willing to take risks, and they were willing to go all in on finding a solution. They weren't sitting around saying, I'm only going to try this little thing as long as nobody says no, as long as this, and as long as I get private sector support for this. The reason that we need private sector money is we've given most public wealth. This country was founded on a couple of founding documents that understood that we hold these truths to be self-evident. The governments are created for the well-being of the people. That's why they're organized. This was a 16th century idea combined with an Iroquois idea that was even older, that we were self-governing. And we as a country have a history. I'm not too far from the Delaware River. There are two sets of canals on either side of the Delaware River. On the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River is by a now rusting, slightly repaired lock about 35 miles north of Philadelphia, about 15 miles north of New Hope. It's a little placard that says that from the 1826 to 1864, roughly, the state of Pennsylvania built 1,000 miles of canals. It didn't say a public-private partnership. It said the state of Pennsylvania. We have 1,000-mile canal. The Erie Canal was not built. It was built with some private money, but it was built by the state of New York. Why was it? It was built for the common good. It was built for the common weal. We understood as a community that when we had common issues, we built them. We did that through the Civil War. After the Civil War, we built all kinds of social structures. And in fact, the Republican Party, there's a lovely article recently by Heather Cox Richardson, where she talks about one of the formative moments in Abraham Lincoln's career was when the newly founded town of New Salem, and we're not going to talk about who the land from New Salem was taken from. Well, it's a conversation for another moment. Was failing economically because the river it was put on was too shallow and needed to be dredged, and the community refused to collectively put the tax money, public money up, because no individual could do it on their own. So the town failed. That was a formative lesson for him. The Republican Party in its original formation, again, let's not try to compare the Republican Party under Lincoln to anything under that same name today. What's today is about as far from the Republican, a little bit different. Let's just leave it at that. But it was founded on a notion of national solidarity. It was founded on, however primitive a notion that to write the notion of equality, however primitively it did, filled with racism, but still different from what had been before. It was, and the United States needs to regroup that sense of solidarity. We've spent and this will tie back into ecology in just a second. We've spent a long time living under, two different mantras. Again, these metaphors count. In England was Maggie Thatcher's very famous, infamous dictum that she didn't recognize society. There's no such thing as society. All she recognized were individuals. Again, not true, not even remotely true, but boy, does that allow you to be selfish. And Ronald Reagan's comparable notion, which he said to everybody and anywhere as often as he could, even though he didn't mean it, or he meant it selectively. The 10 scariest words in the English language are, we're from the government and we're here to help. That was so powerful that even Bill Clinton decided he would parrot that in the early 90s. Okay, so we've created these metaphors. Remember, we started this conversation about how important metaphors are. We've created these metaphors, founding metaphors in our country, that we cannot act together. We cannot do big things. That's too hard. Yet our history is filled with just the opposite. Our history is filled with example after example after example. We changed. We let ourselves get selfish. We let ourselves go inward. We didn't fight the political fight that we needed to fight. We didn't fight the social fight. We're starting to get that now. We're now starting to recover what we did. Now we had, in the under Eisenhower, we had a 92% marginal tax rate, and the country thrived economically. There's no question that what we've done is we've used public benefit to support private interest to the point where the private interests think they deserve it and think they own it and think that's what's gone on. We have to recapture the country for the country. That's a political mission, but it's only a political mission if people understand it. And young people do it, but old fogies like me, do not. And the people in power do not. And certainly white Jewish boys like me are not the people who are solving the problem. We're basically the people who've enabled it and continue to be served by it. So we have to break those rules. We have to stop thinking about business as usual. Now let's get back to where I think there's some real positive action. So if we have three models of response, of collective response, if we have the moonshot, which is really a technical response for a single goal brought up by the paranoia of the Cold War, but very real and very successful. We have World War II, which was a national mobilization and really is what we need, but we're never going to get it because we don't treat this like a war. even though and in World War II, we went to 40% of America's food being grown at home. We could do that again easily. And then we have the Great Depression, which is sort of the model that Biden is doing. Well, one of the great things of the Great Depression was all of the collective public work he funded. And he funded it Roosevelt funded across the board. He had the Writers Project, the Photographers Project, the Farming Project. He had the Civilian Conservation. What if we took all of those ideas and created a universal national service program that folded all of these things and expanded and it gave young people after age 17 to 19, 2 years of working from the military to the Civilian Conservation Corps equivalent, to the rural health issues, across the board of public service jobs in exchange for some financial stake that'll help them later, and college or education, higher education, whether that's at a university, a public university, a trade school, or some other equivalent of post learning. And at that point, that's how we're going to, what are we going to do with the workforce we need? How are we going to train the millions of people we need? How are we going to create a sense of collective work and collective opportunity? We're in a position where we have an opportunity to to rebuild the notion that we have to survive as a collective entity and that we have to be responsive to the world around us. This is talking to us now. This is an opportunity that's saying, let's take this seriously. Let's build on what you've done. It's a great idea. Let's take that for what it really needs to do and rethink what that means. So suddenly you have millions of people coming out of this, understanding what working together means, understanding that it's nourishing not only economically, but morally, socially, ethically, and the value of doing work together and doing it well. And place-based work is incalculable. So there's an opportunity.
I think that you are 100% right, especially on the job training and the job workforce. This is a great time for there to be a shift, not only in our economy, but a shift in an era. Just like there was the shift in the industrial age to really get people motivated to get out there and work. This environmental shift, if played right, can actually be the shift that we need to be able to sustain ourselves and move into the next era of human existence. And I'd love to talk to you about that more, maybe on another.
We'll have to do a follow-up.
It's really important to talk about jobs and job training. In a situation like.
And by the way, the biggest unclaimed job market that we haven't touched, but we could access, is in transforming agriculture into a regenerative process. Because agriculture we used to be a nation of people growing food. Relatively few people in trade, relatively few people in industry, a whole lot of people growing food. We think we've done better by changing that, but maybe we haven't. Maybe we should maybe we should think about what it would take to be a whole other group of a nation again, where a whole lot more people were working in agriculture. And guess what? A whole lot less machines, a whole lot less fossil fuel, a whole lot less need for input. So it's flipping the metaphor again. It's an opportunity, but it also gives people a chance to be place-based, where the harvest preserves the system, where the act of growing regeneratively and working with the land makes the land healthier. The healthier land absorbs more carbon, does all these things. But it all works together if you change the way you farm, and you change the way you do that. You also have more work, because instead of making people more like machines and making plants more able to be harvested by machine, you have polyculture. It's too complicated for machines. You actually have to have people doing it again, and those people aren't, designed to be as de-skilled as possible, so you can treat them like robots and marginalized as much as possible. They start to be skilled labor again, and that the money that you're saving from all this upfront investment in heavy equipment and capital expense starts to be accessible to the labor force, and suddenly you're actually paying people well enough so they don't have to be migrant workers. They can actually be in-place workers, and they can actually settle down. And you have rural communities where there's reasons to stay in the rural community, so that the best and brightest kids don't leave because there's nothing for them to do except, you know, all the things we know that it's the social destruction. So you have all of these, you know, rethinking what we're doing, rethinking how we do things, creates these tools by which environmental justice creates social justice.
Absolutely. And we are running out of
if you-
time. I just want to wrap up with your points that you've said over and over again. We have to rethink how we're doing things. Right. And if anyone's going to walk away from this particular segment, because there was a lot of information shared, I would highly recommend watching this a few times. But rethink the way we're doing things. That's the most important message that we have out there, because we kind of, we've caused some damage in the past 40 years, 50 years. And it's time to kind of maybe revert back to the way things used to be done, or think of a way to do it differently.
To learn, you know, I mean, one of the things we're terrible as a country, this is another bad side of American exceptionalism, is we can't learn from other people. We have to insist that we're the best and the brightest, even when it's manifestly untrue.
Yes. There's
an awful lot of things that people have done elsewhere, are doing elsewhere, have done in the past. All of those things should feed. This is Whitman's idea. We should be hungry for it. We should learn from other people. We should be willing to be open to the past and the present. It's not only, you know, and we should be, you know, this is a topic for another time. We should be thinking what value is. I mean, the biggest thing is, what are we valuing? Why are we valuing the things we value now when they obviously don't give us much return? You know, again, I hate to beat on Jeff Bezos, but as the richest man in the world, he's hardly immune from being beaten on. Tell me what the marginal value for these extra $34 billion is in any way, shape, or possible to Bezos's life. How is it in any way measurably improved by that, by that massive transfer of wealth?
We do have and we do have to wrap up, but we do have a comment in the comments that Jeff Bezos had $10 billion climate change fund. So he did start that. I'll have to look into that.
I asked the great question before that. What have you seen of the output of that? Where have the great results from Jeff Bezos's $10 billion? As of the last time I checked, hard to tell what was going on with that.
Yeah, no, it definitely needs some research. But
that's a great example of greenwashing, I think. You know. And
again, everyone is entitled to research and look into it, and you know, we will definitely have to have a follow-up, because there's a lot to discuss on this subject. So on that, Josh, please tell people how they can find the Center for Force Majeure.
Okay, well, you can look up the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure. I won't spell the acronym out because it's too hard to do. Also, livingforests.org is where we talk about our forest work. I also have some other companies we can talk about later, but one of the things I'd love to come back is to talk about, what does regenerative business look like, and what are some examples, and how can that, what does it mean, what does that walk look like, and how can potentially other people get involved? Because there are a lot of people, there's a lot of really smart people working really hard. They're not necessarily very well connected to each other, but there's a lot of people doing great work, and
that is very true.
We should be
the more communication, and I keep stressing that communication is key. So Joy, I will let you have the last word.
Josh, thank you so much, and I'd love to do another talk regarding getting people employed with some of this environmental justice and environmental social governance going on. What are some of the ways to really shift the employment question, especially in light of COVID? But yeah, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. It's, happy to chat, and let's talk again when, at some point. Very much so.
Absolutely. We'll definitely do a follow-up, because we could go on for hours, and that's just a lot for one episode. So we'll do a follow-up episode, I promise. You guys take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.